In 2017, Austrian Audio busted through the door and started releasing product after product. These guys are mostly former AKG employees, some of who were displaced after AKG shut down their headquarters in Austria. Austrian Audio's goal has been to provide a unique experience with their gear. I have reviewed the X50, X55, and X65, all of which offer a different experience from each other. The X55 and X65 are made for critical listening, to hear nuanced details and imperfections in your recordings. These are vastly different in sound than anything else you will likely ever hear. Recently, Austrian Audio released and sent to me for review 2 new headphones. These are the Hi-X15 and the X25BT. Today, we're taking a look at the X15. This is a $120 headphone. What does this thing do, and is it worthy of consideration? Austrian Audio says that the X15 is a professional headphone. They claim it will provide precise, analytical sound. They also say that the X15 is, quote, the workhorse for everyday use. Austrian Audio says that the X15 will provide crystal clear and precise listening experience and is perfect for studio, stage, rehearsal room, on tour, or practicing at home. The X15 uses the company's proprietary high excursion drivers, hence X. These are specifically designed to reduce unwanted resonance, according to Austrian Audio. In short, Austrian Audio, as we've seen with their other products, is a little bit short on description. They don't say much of anything regarding the sound signature. What they do indicate is that the X15 will provide detail and resolution. The X15 is built of metal and plastic. The plastic seems fairly robust and thick. The ear cups and part of the headband structure are plastic. The yokes and headband itself are metal. The ear pads are spacious as the original X55 and the X65 in my opinion. These are large, over-ear design and fully engulf the ears to provide a solid seal. Passive noise isolation is, I think, excellent. The sound of typing on a keyboard and people talking at moderate volumes next to you are noticeably muffled. Austrian Audio says that the ear pads are replaceable. However, I've tried and can't get them off on the X15. I don't want to rip these apart, and I couldn't find the necessary instructions on the website or in the manual to get these ear pads off the headphone. The ear pads are made of memory foam and are very supple, similar to the X55 and the X65. The headband padding is thick and also made of memory foam. The X15 comes with a standard Austrian Audio carrying bag and the same cable as their other headphones. This cable has a proprietary locking mechanism, but is otherwise soft, agreeable, and prone to minimal microphonics. The headphones collapse into themselves. The ear cups swivel. The X15 can be somewhat portable when folded. As for comfort, the X15 is one of the most comfortable headphones I've worn. It is nearly as comfortable as the X55 and the X65. The headband adds some pressure that the other 2 headphones do not. Consequently, I can feel the headband pressure on my head, though it is not harsh. The X15 has a moderately tight clamp. The plush ear pads mitigate any discomfort for me. I can easily wear the X15 for 3 to 4 hours without difficulty. Overall, Austrian Audio seems to have kept their typical stellar build quality. Yes, there seems to be more plastic on the X15 than on the X55 and the X65, but the headphone is nonetheless solidly constructed. The accessories are perfectly acceptable for the price. Comfort is among the best of any headphone I've used. Some people might find the clamp a bit too tight for their preferences, however. I tested the X15 using numerous sources. This included my Modi Liquid Spark stack, the RME 80i2 DAC, the Matrix Mini I Pro 3, and the Sony NW-ZX507. I used the stock accessories. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The X15 is very easy to drive. It's a sensitive headphone and you can plug them into any source with a 3.5mm jack. You don't need amplification. If you choose to use an amp, a moderately powerful one is more than enough, though frankly, I'm not convinced there's any real audible difference even with an amplifier. Keep in mind that Austrian Audio cautions that the maximum power input on these should be 150 milliwatts. Austrian Audio doesn't say anything about the X15's bass response. From my tests, it appears that this headphone has a sub-bass roll-off, but a fairly neutral mid-bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a constant rumble from the beginning of the song. The X15 did present this detail, but it sounded distant and had fast transients. Even with higher volumes, the rumble was underemphasized. There was a noticeable difference from the neutral Allo Audio S4X, but this presentation was similar to what I heard on the Aventone Planar. When the crescendo hit, the organ cut through the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible, but had fast reverberation. I could hear individual group sets, and there was good separation and clarity among them. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass was easily audible. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were about shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This is supposed to pan from right to left to center. The X15 clearly recreated the sound of rolling marbles. However, I could not hear the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the X15 presented all of them. There was minimal melding from one drum to the next. Each drum strike had a sharp, thwacking sound. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, Nupatek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the X15 made the subwoofer sound distant, like the subwoofer was in a completely different room. The drums had more energy than the sub-bass and seemed clear and distinct. The vocals were 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I used these songs to listen for audible bass distortion. Even at high volume, the X15 did not present audible distortion. Instead, the bass remained clear and detailed. Overall, the X15 has a sub-bass roll-off. Mid-bass is, I think, close to neutral. There is good separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. In fact, this separation is similar to that of the X55 and the X65. The X15 presents clarity and resolution in the bass region. Once again, Austrian Audio doesn't say anything about the X15's mids response. My tests indicate that this headphone has forward mids with emphasized sibilance. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there's natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The X15 accentuated both. The vocal grain seemed to be marginally pushed, but the sibilance was very much emphasized. This was far more than what the Allo S4X does, and nearly as prominent as on the HD560S. Orla's voice was easily 2 steps ahead of the instruments. The drums and guitar were clear and showed minimal melding. Timbre seemed correct. In Want You Back by Haim, the X15 confirmed that it materially emphasizes female sibilance. It was not close to neutral and indeed seemed comparable to that of the HD560S. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary vocalist says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The X15 clearly recreated this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists in the song, and the X15 presented their voices separate, clear, distinct. Even when the instruments played at maximum, all 3 vocalists were easily audible in the mix, each with her specific tonality. The drums, guitar, bass, and piano seemed to have correct timbre. There was minimal melding among their notes. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the X15 correctly rendered the ukulele and drums. The bass, however, seemed a little bit recessed. All 3 instruments were separate, and it was easy to concentrate on one or the other. The primary male vocalist's voice also had emphasized sibilance, though not quite as much as with female artists. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most IEMs and headphones I've tested cannot reveal this detail. The X15 was just barely able to separate their voices. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The X15 perfectly rendered these details. Overall, the X15 has forward mids. There's a noticeable and considerable sibilance emphasis for both male and female artists. If your recording has sibilance mixed in, these headphones will push them into your ears. Timbre was always correct. The X15 was able to provide clarity, resolution, and detail in the mids region. Austrian Audio does not explain the treble response on the X15. My tests indicate that there is a slight emphasis in the mid to upper treble region. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the X15 presented the brass and horns with lots of clarity. These instruments were separated from each other and retained their nasally sound signatures. However, it also seemed like their higher-pitched notes were a little emphasized, at least more so than what I heard on the Aventone Planar and marginally more than what I heard on the Allo S4X. I could easily hear the various group sets which stood out from each other. The timphony was audible, but slightly underemphasized. The X15 presents width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, instruments are separated into the wings and some are further ahead of others, adding a sense of rows or depth. However, the X15 did not make sounds appear above or below. In flight from the city, the X15 made the piano sound like it was about 10 feet away. The bassy notes were noticeably underemphasized and had fast transients. I could easily and clearly hear the pops and sizzles, electric buzzing effects, and these are details that are mixed into the bottom layer of this track. The cello was clear and melded only marginally with the piano. I could hear the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the X15 rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and the bass a few steps behind. There was good separation among all instruments and I could concentrate on any one without difficulty. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in minor differences in tonality. The X15 clearly and consistently showed these variances. The saxophone was smooth, but it appeared that there was a bit of additional energy in the higher register notes. This was a minor difference when I compared it to the Audiolus 4X, which tended to have slightly less energy than the X15. Overall, the X15 presents marginally elevated treble response. It is never harsh or piercing. There is considerable clarity and separation in this region. Minute details, I think, are easily audible. What type of detail can you expect from a headphone that costs around $100? I mean, I've tested headphones costing many hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, and it's rare to find one that excels in detail retrieval. I was a little bit skeptical about the X15's detail ability. Then I listened at length and realized that Austrian Audio's use of their high excursion drivers in this headphone is not a gimmick. In other words, the X15 provides a lot of detail and clarity, something that we've come to expect from Austrian Audio headphones. The X15 does not disappoint in this respect. Obvious details are always, without doubt, present. Subtle details are almost always clear. There were some occasions where vocal sibilants drowned out minor perturbations of vocalists, but that's the only time when I felt the X15 might have obscured some details, and again, it was dependent upon whether or not there was sibilants in the original track to begin with. Multiple vocalists, sharp intakes of breaths, pops and sizzles, electric buzzing, twangs of guitar strings, gravelly emphasis in vocals, layered instruments, creaking of wood, shifting of cellos, these are all details that the X15 renders without difficulty. I have a quantitative test I use to determine detail and resolution. I listened to the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HD800S presents 22 footsteps, the Focal Clear, 18. The Austrian Audio Hi-X15 presents 16 to 17. The X55 presents 16 footsteps. The Hi-Fi Man Sundara, Aventone Planar, Sifka Phoenix, and Beyerdynamic DT1990 each present 10 to 11 footsteps. The Audeze LCD2 Closed and LCD2 Classic each provide 7 to 8. The Monolith M1070, M1570, Sifka Robin, and Ultrasound Pro 1480i all provide 8 to 9 footsteps, and the older M1060C provides 7 footsteps. The Audeze LCD1 and the HD6XX present 6 to 7. The Neumann NDH20 provides 5 to 6 footsteps. The Austrian Audio Hi-X15 presented 13 to 14 clear footsteps. On this scale, I use the HD6XX and the LCD1 as my average performers. Any headphone that renders more or less footsteps gets judged accordingly. Consequently, the NDH20 would be below average on my scale, and the Hi-Fi Man Sundara would be above average, and the HD800S would be the king of the hill. This test confirms what I heard throughout my time with the X15. It provides well above average detail, rivaling the results of the Hi-Fi Man Sundara and the DT1990, among others. One of the critical aspects, I think, is that the X15 does not emphasize bass and parses out elements in a mix. This results in a lot of clarity and separation that is not typically present in audiophile headphones. In other words, not present in headphones that provide a warm or balanced sound signature. Just as with my detail test, I have a scale I use to determine Soundstage. Once again, I didn't really have much expectation from the X15. However, when I listened to it, I was somewhat surprised by the overall Soundstage performance. In my view, it has at least average to perhaps above average Soundstage. Let's talk about other headphones on my Soundstage scale. The Audeze Mobius and All Beats headphones have claustrophobic Soundstage. The NDH20 and ATH-M60X have below average Soundstage. The HD6XX and LCD1 have average Soundstage. The Sifka Phoenix, Emotiva GR1, and Ultrasound Pro 1480i have average to maybe about above average Soundstage, depending on the particular recording. The Hi-Fi Sendara, Avantone Planar, Austrian Audio Hi-X15, and the X65 and the LCD2 Classic have above average Soundstage. The Hi-Fi Man Diva has wide Soundstage. The HD800S has super wide Soundstage. On this scale, I use the HD6XX and then the LCD1 as my average standard. Anything above or below is judged accordingly. Here, with the X15, it appears to me that its soundstage is greater than that of the HD6XX and the LCD1 and close to the presentation of the Hi-Fi Man Sendara. The Sendara, however, I think is marginally wider. The X15 has width and depth, but no verticality. It can separate, parse out elements in a track. It can reveal instruments into the wings and layered, like an orchestra arrangement. Austrian Audio got some pushback from the audiophile community because of the sound signature of their headphones. As I made clear in my X55 and X65 reviews, the Austrian Audio headphones are primarily a critical listening, detail-oriented gear. You can use them for pleasure if you want, but that's not really the design. The X15 is very similar in this regard to the X55 and the X65. Austrian Audio says that the X15 is the workhorse for everyday use, and that somewhat implies general purpose use. Look, if your goal is to have a headphone that provides minute details every day, then I suppose the X15 could be considered a workhorse for you. The X15 has a sub-bass roll-off, similar to planar magnetic headphones. Mid-bass is close to neutral. Transients is fast, possibly as fast as typical planar drivers. The X15 has good separation of sub-bass from mid-bass, resulting in bass detail and resolution. The bass does not bleed into the mids. The mids are forward and quite sibilant. Female artists will receive a significant emphasis in their sibilant vocals, and male artists will receive a somewhat more tame emphasis. If your recordings have sibilants mixed in, the X15 will push that detail into your ears. However, the X15 also has clarity, detail, and separation in the mids region. Timbre seems to be correct. The treble is marginally emphasized in the upper treble area. It's not a huge deviation from neutral, but it is noticeable. Again, the X15 renders detail, separation, and clarity among treble instruments. Nothing sounds harsh or piercing in this region. The X15 has average to above average soundstage. It has above average detail retrieval, a little bit more than the Hi-Fi Man Sendara, the DT1990, and the Avantone Planar, but less than the X55, the X65, the Focal Clear, and obviously the HD800S. In my view, the X15 is an analytical headphone. It does not have a warm, smooth, or relaxing signature. It's probably not the headphone most would pick up and listen to after a long day, at least not if you enjoy modern pop, rock, and hip-hop. But if you like jazz, orchestral compositions, classical, ambience, and other such genres, then the X15 might be rather pleasant, though different from what you've likely heard before. If you want as much detail, clarity, separation, and soundstage as you can get for around this price, well, come on. I'm already strongly indicating to you before we get to the conclusion that this headphone is going to provide that performance. I think reviewers should compare products as often as possible. That's the only way to put things into context, and the only way you, the consumer, can start to make sense of the nonsense in the audiophile world. Here, we will compare the X15 to other headphones. I've chosen to compare against the X55, the DT1990, and the NDH20. For this test, I used the stock accessories. I plugged each headphone into a passive AB switch. That switch was plugged into my Army ADI2 DAC and my Modi Liquid Spark stack. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. And of course, I tried the volume match. The X55 has less prominent sub-bass than the X15, therefore the X15 has a bit more bass emphasis in comparison. The X55's bass overall has slightly faster transients and more clarity than the X15. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is marginally greater on the X55. Mid-bass impact is very similar, however. The mids are similar between these headphones. The X55 and X15 both accentuate sibilants. It appears to be to the same or nearly identical degrees. Vocal grain is evidently similar as well. However, the X55 separates all mid-centric elements a bit more clearly than the X15. Further, the X15 presents vocals a little bit closer to the ears. The X15 and X55 have very similar treble emphasis. Both push treble above neutral. It seemed, after going back and forth, that the X15 might have an ever so slightly greater treble emphasis than the X55, but this was not a consistent result. What was consistent is that the X55 is clearer in the treble region and separates all instruments more obviously. The X15 has more intimate presentation of treble instruments than the X55. The X55 has greater soundstage and detail. The DT1990 and X15 seem to have very similar sub-bass rendition. Both have fast transients, at least faster than typical dynamic drivers. Reverberation is hard to distinguish. The 1990 provides marginally greater separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. The X15 seems to have sharper and slightly harder mid-bass impact. Overall clarity is slightly more obvious on the 1990. The mids are not exactly the same, but I think similar. Both headphones accentuate vocal sibilants and grain. Comparing back and forth, there were only slight differences, with the X15 seemingly providing a tiny bit more energy for this detail. Vocals are forward in both headphones, but the X15 separates them from instruments a little bit more clearly. The treble is marginally different. Both headphones accentuate this frequency. However, the 1990 appears to have a slightly greater emphasis. The X15 has a bit more separation among treble instruments. Instruments seem a little bit closer to the ears on the 1990. The DT1990 has marginally wider soundstage, but the X15 has greater and a bit clearer detail retrieval. The NDH20 has slightly greater sub-bass presence than the X15. Transients is also slower on the NDH20. However, the X15 is noticeably clearer in the bass region and provides far greater separation of sub-bass from mid-bass. Bass detail is obvious on the X15, while it is harder to determine on the NDH20. Mid-bass impact is marginally harder on the NDH20. The mids are quite different between these headphones. The X15 pushes vocals forward and emphasizes vocal grain and sibilants. The NDH20 presents vocals closer together with instruments and only marginally accentuates sibilants. The NDH20 does not seem to emphasize vocal grain. Indeed, the NDH20 is considerably closer to neutral with respect to mids when compared to the X15, X55, or even the DT1990. Separation of mid-centric instruments is night and day different. The X15 simply has more clarity, separation, and detail in this region. Treble on the NDH20 receives a slight emphasis. The X15, in comparison, has a greater treble push. Going back and forth, the NDH20 appears to be closer to neutral in this regard. However, the X15 provides noticeably greater separation of treble instruments, more clarity, and more detail. The X15 has significantly wider soundstage and greater detail retrieval than the NDH20. When we do comparisons, we start to see how much difference there really is from one product to the next. When you do comparisons regularly, you begin to understand if a product is overpriced for its performance or is something unique. The X15 shares tuning with the X55. There is cohesion between their performances. However, these two headphones do not sound identical. The X15 has a little bit more bass, a little bit less clarity and detail than the X55. The X15's presentation is more intimate than the X55. In other words, instruments and vocals appear a little bit closer to the ears on the X15. When you compare the X15 to the DT1990 and the NDH20, you hear more immediate differences. There is no mistaking the X15 for either of these headphones. Paying 4 to 5 times the cost of the X15 does not result in 4 to 5 times more soundstage, clarity, detail, or placement. In fact, if there is a correlation at all between price and performance, one could more justifiably argue that the more you pay, the less you actually get in return. It is evident that the X15, X55, DT1990, and the NDH20 all have different performance, strengths, and of course weaknesses. Some, all, or none of these headphones might fit into your particular listening style. If you prefer to use headphones in the mixing booth, then you will have to decide what facets you absolutely need and what performance you can live without. I have conversations with people about a product's worthiness. People ask if a product is worth it, or complain that my assessment of value is far below what they value the product at. There is clearly a lot of subjective interpretation involved when you decide what you want to buy, but there's also a healthy amount of objective analysis, and when you soberly think about price and performance, you tend to notice there is no real correlation there. In other words, you don't get better performance the more you pay. And by performance, I mean things like soundstage, clarity, detail retrieval, and placement. I do not mean the overall sound signature, rather specific attributes. After all, preferences about sound signature is a personal matter. The headphone with the most mediocre performance could be your favorite because of how it renders your music overall. The Hi-X15 emphasizes a few things for us. First, that Austrian Audio has its own sound signature and is sticking with it. You may not like it and you may not agree with it, but Austrian Audio's tuning is vastly different from what others do in the market. Second, you don't have to pay hundreds of dollars to achieve above-average soundstage, detail retrieval, build, or comfort. All of these attributes can be obtained for less than the price of some of the most hyped stuff in the market. And third, price is a terrible indicator of performance. The X15 has the typical Austrian Audio tuning. It's an analytical headphone. It's not as clear, resolving, detailed as the more expensive X55 or the X65, but it provides so much of what these headphones have that the X15 does not seem to be an orphan child. The X15 has above-average soundstage, clearly above-average detail, above-average clarity, above-average placement, and good comfort. In exchange, you're getting bass roll-off, a mid-centric push that emphasizes vocal grain and sibilance, and a slightly emphasized treble. This brings us to value. Yes, the X15 is value. At $120, Austrian Audio provides us something that I have not yet experienced from any other company in this price range. As I've said many times in the past, the Austrian Audio headphones, at least the current versions, are not intended for audiophiles. They are for analytical listening. While audiophiles can and do use these headphones, if you walk into an Austrian Audio headphone expecting HD6XX sound, then you will be deeply disappointed. If you want to experience your music different from what AKG, audeze, Sony, Beyerdynamic, Sennheiser, Audio-Technica, and many other companies offer, then Austrian Audio is a standout company for that purpose. The X15 is not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but sometimes it's good to try a different flavor. At $120, the X15 justifies its price and might be enticing for those who want a new experience without spending a lot of cash.